She's back. Let's go. Schedule going forward this week's going to next 10 days is going to be a busy time. Probably Wednesday afternoonish. Certainly before 6 p.m. Wednesday night. Quiz number 2 will be posted. Quiz number 2 is over chapters 4 and 5. Who was supposed to present today? Kiana was? Okay. So, chapters 4 and 5. Don't forget, when you present, then email me what you do, your PowerPoint. Probably Saturday afternoon. I will probably make that due by midnight Saturday. Sometime during the day Saturday, I will deploy, post, make available exam number 1. Exam number 1 covers chapters 1 through 5. Okay, so you will have, these will be timed just like the last one. Did you ask me a question?
Yes, sir. How long will it be? How long will exam 1 be?
Exam 1, I will probably give you 75 minutes to do it all. Does that make sense? There will probably be, there'll be more than that many questions. You know what I mean? Typically I think in terms, okay, since you have access to your materials, etc., but I don't want you, this isn't just a research project to look it up and write it down. I usually give about 45 seconds a question, more or less, give or take. Of course, some of them are easy. Some of them you know, because you studied, you remembered, you learned. I do want, just a reminder on the discussion, I will grade it harder. You will have to really be great to get full credit on a discussion question. I mean, you will just have to hit pretty much every significant item, topic related to the discussion, okay? I will today post some discussion for quiz 2 and exam 1, and you know how I do that now. I post more than I'm going to put on the test, so it's not like, well, okay, I'll just learn 3 of them and I'll be good. No, that's not how that works. So, okay, questions? Other questions? All right. Let me pick up, and I'm probably going to insert a thing or two that I kind of not sure we nailed down the way I wanted to. All right. We were talking about, I think we were in the middle of a British government, true? Oh, do you see what I put on the board? What do you know about Oh Say Can You See? What is that? National anthem, or also called the Star Spangled Banner, really the official name. Who wrote it? Who? Francis Scott Key, absolutely. When did he write it? Oh, sorry. I didn't coach Haley very well. Thank you. Francis Scott Key wrote it. What year? Let's start with the year.
17.
No. It's a good guess. I mean, but no. 1814. He actually wrote it last night or early this morning. September 13, 14 is the anniversary of that. It was during what war? Somebody said it, I think. War of 1812. Exactly. He wrote it he was on board a ship because he went to free a friend of his to negotiate the release of a friend of his. He was an attorney, among other things, but he went to negotiate the release of his friend because he had been captured during the war by the British off the coast of Baltimore, Maryland. And so he went and got it, but they were holding them before they actually released him and let him go free. And he was sitting there watching the bombing of, anybody know? Fort McHenry. And he was watching the bombing, and the British bombed all night, but they couldn't defeat the fort. They held the fort, which means the flag was still waving, and it was in that moment that he wrote the words, "Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light?" You know the rest of it? It's easier to sing it. I always forget when I start saying it. But anyway, so he wrote those words. It was then put to a tune that was really an English drinking song. The tune was that they appropriated the tune for the Star-Spangled Banner, which was often true, by the way. A lot of even Christian hymns have secular tunes to them. They put Christian words to secular melodies. Anyway, so it was done. Occasion, I just told you, it was the bombing of Fort McHenry. Flag was still there. And then, of course, the great line at the bottom really is. I mean, that was the general sentiment. I think it is still many of us still feel that way about our country. We're the land of the free and the home of the brave. Some people want to totally disparage our country. Does our country have problems? Yes. Have we always had problems? Yes. Does every country of the world have problems? Yes. I mean, it's like sometimes people said this, and I've said this before, but I'll say it again. It's almost like perfection is the goal, but we'll never be perfect. I mean, so why are you, are we better? Absolutely. We are better in many regards as a country than we've ever been. Please read the section about Abigail Adams' correspondence in your textbook. Do you remember what she advocated as she wrote to her husband, among others? She advocated for whose rights? Women's rights, absolutely. So even in the founding of our country, there was this push, hey, if we're really the land of the free, then let's all be free. Let's all have the same rights, etc. When was the Star-Spangled Banner generally accepted and embraced by American people? If you don't have a date, give me a time frame. Okay, hang on to that. Actually, the song got accepted very, very quickly after he wrote it. It became official when what president said, you know what, we're playing this at all public gatherings. President with first and last name started with the same letter toward the end of the alphabet. How's that for a clue? Woodrow Wilson, 1916, the way I remember it. But Woodrow Wilson was the president that said, hey, this is, we love this song. We play this song. It conveys who we are as a country. So it was 1960. However, it was not officially adopted as our national anthem. That's just a descriptor. Every country has a national anthem. The name of the song is the Star-Spangled Banner. In what year? If Wilson said we're going to start playing it at all public gatherings, etc., like what? What's a nice big public gathering? Huh? Athletics, yeah, but baseball in particular, yeah, because National Football League was a latecomer to all that. But yeah, like baseball games, etc., was played. It was not officially adopted until 1931. Anybody surprised by that? That's often true. You know what I mean? Things become commonplace and accepted practice or embraced long before they get codified. You know what the word codified means? Put into what? What? Code or law. Okay. Put into the law. All right. Wherever I was, that's where I'm going to start. I was talking about the British government, right? The English government. Did I talk to you about the colonial government? I don't think so. Let me talk about colonial government quickly. Number one, these are aspects of the government in the colonies. They had an appointed governor. Appointed by whom? King George III in this case. They also had an appointed council of advisors. But then they had, number three, an elected assembly. Kind of like a little parliament, if you will, just like they had in England. An elected assembly. The elected assembly had the power to do two big things. What? Just like now. Two big things on the power to do what? Tax issue taxes, collect tax money, and what else do you do once you collect the taxes? Spend it. So they had those two critical powers the elected assembly did. And number 4, there was direct representation. By the way, we are only represented by the people that we elect. That makes sense? That's why sometimes congressmen and senators do get it right. They have an obligation to the people that sent them there. That makes sense? So, all right. Let me talk about the British trade regulations. The economic system at the time was actually mercantilism, which basically in essence, was trying to create an empire. Between the mother country of England and the colonies here in America, the goal was to become the most wealthy and powerful one in the world. Why? Because money tends to equal power. It just does. And power at its root, what's it, at its base nature is what? If you have power, then you have influence, meaning you can get your way, etc. So that's really what's going on here. Britain didn't find gold and silver here, but they were committed to getting wealthy by what means? Trade. Okay? The buying and selling of goods, trade. There was, first of all, the Navigation Acts. Much of this, of course, is in your textbook, if not all of it, but I wanted to highlight these certain things. Number 1, the Navigation Acts. Those are trade laws. Between about 1650 and 1750, trade with the British Empire could only be done on British ships. That was a part of those Navigation Acts, only on British ships. Secondly, ships must be manned with British crews. And number 3, certain enumerated items could only be traded within the British Empire. Certain things were designated. They couldn't go to other countries, only within parts of the British Empire. True or false? The main countries of Europe expanded to many parts of the world. True? Yeah, it wasn't just America. That was one of them and became one of the key ones. But yeah, no, they were expanding elsewhere. In fact, that would be true for many, many decades after our revolution. The empire continued to try to find places to branch out. True or false? Countries of the world are still expanding their influence in other countries and taking some control of certain things. True or false? True. Visited with some friends who are stateside, meaning here, for just a couple of more months before they go back to the country of Sierra Leone. Anybody know where that is? It's on the continent of? Yes? Africa. Y'all were about to say Africa, I could tell. All right. It's on the western side of Africa. It's actually, can you see the continent of Africa? It's just as you come around before it bends back to the east. You know, the little hook or crook or element of it, it's right there. Blood Diamond was really the first movie that kind of just catapulted Sierra Leone into kind of a national prominence, if you will. They went through a decade-long civil war. Anyway, the country truly is a third world country, meaning it's very underdeveloped. The point of my story was this. Guess who, in exchange for mineral rights and land in the country, is building roads, providing infrastructure like that, roads to get around, etc. Guess what country of the world is doing that in exchange for mineral rights and property? The main one. China. So what is a possibility? China will control that country. You know what I mean? Because it's not like, now actually, the truth be told, America tends to go in and give aid to places, tends to, not always, there are glaring examples of otherwise, actually gives it unconditionally. I mean, that's a part of our federal budget is hundreds of millions billions of dollars, once it's all added up, in aid to foreign countries that is just, quote, given away. Now, what happens to a lot of that aid? What? It doesn't go where it's supposed to go. Why? Because of humanity. Because there is corruption in the world. Because people all along the way are basically stealing some of that money, or it's done for a lot of reasons. That's just the reality of the world. Now, I won't go into all of that, so there's a lot to consider when it comes to our national federal government. All right. Number 2, manufacturing acts, ACTS. Navigation acts was one. Number 2 is manufacturing acts. Whether it was, all kinds of stuff. The Wool and Iron Acts, among others. There was, might even been a Hat Act. Anyway, it was designed for protection of whom?
Business owners.
Huh? Business owners, where? In England, the mother country. I mean, these acts were designed to protect businesses and businessmen. You could only make certain things. That's really the manufacturing acts. Certain things could only be made in England. And so then they were imported, taken to the colonies, and sold. Number 3, there was, I'll call this a vacillating enforcement. Vacillating enforcement. The enforcement of laws actually hurt instead of helped trade. Because they discovered that all of these laws, all of these acts caused more harm than good, they just didn't enforce them. They didn't repeal them necessarily, they just didn't enforce them. But then, as America seemed to gain in power and influence, they began to enforce them again. Does that make sense? So there was this period, it's just like that happens today. Some things get enforced more forcibly than others at any given time. Number 4, smuggling and bribery. The ways of getting around some of the problems of that vacillating enforcement became exports being smuggled in. Bribery became a way of life. If you did the right people, you know the right people, you grease those palms with enough cash, then things go on. Back to my friends from Sierra Leone. Guess what? It's officially illegal to ask for a bribe if you're in any kind of law enforcement or government position. But do you know one way around that? They ask for water. Do you have any water? In many places, not every person, but many of them, that's code for cough up the cash. Happens all over the world, happens wherever. Don't be naive. Most, if not all of you are driving. It's time for you to be wise in the ways it happens all over the world. Every day, bribes are taken. I mean, and that speaks to the culture. That speaks to individuals' commitment to honesty, integrity, and the like, but it happened. And it happened back then. So there was smuggling, sneaking goods in, so they didn't have to pay the tax. There was bribery, getting them passed through customs or wherever. So the governor, appointed by the king, paid by the colonists. So where were the governors in the whole big scheme of things? Caught right in the middle. The taxes collected from the colonists actually paid their salary, but he was appointed by the King of England, so there was a dual obligation in his eyes. So, all right, the new era. I think I'm going to call this the new era in English colonial policy. Happened from 1760 to 1760 to 1770. That decade leading up to the decade of the Revolution. The road to the Revolution. Number 1, it was the end of salutary neglect. No longer would the laws on the books be neglected. Wars are expensive. Empire building cost a lot of money. And so for the King of England to accomplish his purpose, it was time to enforce old laws and enact new ones. The colonies are going to fight. They're going to fit into the empire or be a part of the burden. And And the king decided, you're going to be a part of my empire. You're going to bear your part of the burden to run this empire, which happened through taxation. And so that's where King George III, he was actually came to power in 1760. The two previous kings had really cared more about Germany in Europe than they did the colonies. Parliament had become very powerful during that time period as well. So when King George III comes to power in 1760, he decides, you know what, it's a new day in the British Empire, and it's going to be a new day for the American colonies. There was number two, the end of the salutary neglect of laws. Number two, there is the threat to colonial prosperity. The proclamation line of 1763, no Englishman may go west of the mountains. Why? Who's west of the mountains? French and Indians. And so that was a way to try to control the conflict as the French and Indian War came to a close, because they didn't want to continue to spend. Wars cost what? Money. So that's he's trying to cut expenses there. Number two, the Sugar Act of 1764 was a tariff, an import tax that was actually set at 6 pence, but it was then cut to 3 pence. But they were committed to collect the Sugar Act. Now, how many of you cook? Sugar is used a lot when you cook, isn't it? So there would have been this constant stream of paying the tax on sugar. The Currency Act of 1764. You cannot make money. Cannot create money. So, the most sensitive nerve in the body, I think, is the one that leads directly to the pocketbook. Money. In fact, you still hear it all the time. You hear politicians talk about money. Well, if you're going to spend money, what do you have to do? You have to make money. How do governments make money? Taxes, exactly. I mean, that's the way it always has been. That's the way it always will be. And so when it comes to politics, some things, here, I'll make this one political statement because it does play into the revolution. Some things are great ideas theoretically. You know what that means? What does that mean?
They sound good.
Huh?
They sound good, but
They sound good. And in theory, they are good. But a theoretical idea, to be of any use at all, has to become what? What's the other word? Theoretical, or we usually use the practical. A theoretical idea. Okay, here's an idea for you. The government should pay every citizen, because you got to draw the line somewhere. Or, okay, well, no, let's do it better. The federal government should pay every person who resides in the United States of America. That's limiting. That excludes what? To the north? Canada. To the south? Okay, but every person residing in America, the government should pay, let's pick a number, $3,000 a month. Anybody vote for that? It's a great idea, isn't it? That means that's $3,000 in your pocket. Great idea, right? But what's the practical reality of that? Do the math. Let's just pick a round number. 350 million Americans. Somebody do the math on that. Use a calculator. 350 million people living in America. It may be closer to 375, but we're just using a round number. If everyone got $3,000 a month, not a bad wage, by the way. What's that number? Can you read the zeros in it? Anybody come up with it? I didn't do this ahead of time, so.
Looks like $1,050,000,000 a month.
$1,050,000,000,000. How often?
Every month.
Every single month. So an idea that says, well, yeah, the government ought to pay us because we've been paying in. For some of us who are old, we've been paying a lot of taxes over the years, over the decade. But the reality is, just to spend $1 trillion a month to send money to people residing in a country, I mean, it's not practically real. I mean, we think, and so when you come up with an idea, the idea may be a good theoretical idea, but the practical reality is undoable. That's where wisdom has to kick in for leaders. What happened to King George III in relation to the colonies was the fact that he forgot the practical reality of certain parts of his decision. All right, the threat to colonial prosperity. I think I said that. I talked about currency. Number 3, the threat to evolving democracy. The colonists' history predominantly was from what country? England. So they had a taste, in spite of having a king, they also had a parliament, and so they were acquainted with a form, if you will, if I can phrase it that way, a form of democracy, a form of representative government. So they understood themselves as free Englishmen. We are free people. It was in that context that when number one, the Stamp Act of 1765 was a direct internal tax. Before, they'd only taxed imports, usually called a tariff. After that, this tax would pay directly on something that they used every day. The Stamp Act, they had to pay for what? Yeah, we think it's stamps. No, it was a tax on paper. So that every pamphlet, every leaflet, everything that was printed on paper got taxed. Tariff is often a hidden tax, but they're reminded of paper every single day. So every time they wanted to print something, every time they wanted to distribute something, even a flyer on the door, sale today, everything's half off, tax kicked in. The Stamp Act was one of the critical things that just... began the process of revolt. So that's why it's so matter that you certainly read that section and understand that in the so there was a stamp on paper, and that tax had to be paid. What is happening during these decades in the colonies that made that significant? What is the education level in the colonies? I think the King George III and maybe many others in England thought the colonists were stupid idiots. That's not true. There were a lot of educated people, and education was becoming significant, etc. Which, by the way, in case you wonder who led the way in the field of education, Christians did. Christians were committed to an education. In fact, most of the Ivy League schools were started as schools to train ministers. I mean, that's how they've grown, expanded, morphed, changed, all of that, but that's how they started. Christians were always in the forefront of an education. Educated people utilize what? More so than day laborers. Paper. You know what I mean? They're printing things, they're writing things, they're publishing things. Educated people do that. And so the more educated among the colonists were the people who were most hard hit by the Stamp Act. The Quartering Act, that's the second thing. Stamp Act was number 1. That's a part of this evolving democracy. The Quartering Act of 1765. If there are no barracks, the colonies had to build barracks for troops, or what? House them in their homes. Yeah. It was a law. You didn't get to vote. You didn't choose that, hey, my kids are too small. We're on a tight schedule. We've got too many. No. They began to order those kind of folks. And so there was also the other big part of that, I think, that is growing, is this whole notion of a direct representation that they didn't believe the government had. Number 4, and this would be the last thing here, the psychological problems. Psychological problems. Here's what I mean by that. King George III and many of the governmental leaders in England thought the colonists in the colonies, they were getting away with murder. They thought their view from across the Atlantic Ocean was, gosh, they're in charge of they get to do whatever they want over there, in spite of the attempts at enforcement and the sending of troops and all of that. The idea was the colonists are getting away with murder because they're getting to do whatever they want. They're not under our thumb to the degree that we would like. It is in that regard, that related to the whole notion they were second-class citizens at best. The colonists took those two things and turned them around. We're not second-class citizens, we're free Englishmen. We have a right to govern ourselves. We have a right to throw off tyranny in all of its forms. And it was those things that I think led to that. There was a Stamp Act Congress in 1766. What is a Congress? It's really a convention or a rally. That's what it was. And it was there that they resorted to economic pressure. They decided, you know what? We're tired of paying for paper every time we use paper. So they stopped using as much. It was really a boycott is what it amounted to. It was in that context, in the next couple of 3 years, of course, we learned about the Boston Massacre of 1770. John Hancock was a very wealthy businessman in Boston. He was a big importer and exporter. He owned warehouses of goods. And he really was an expert smuggler, among other things. He just knew how to get around the British troops. And it was in that context, in the resistance that the colonists, John Hancock among others, Paul Revere was another one, that they resisted, and the, quote, massacre happened. It wasn't as big as it was reported, but what has already happened by 1770? There is this growing groundswell that we need to throw off the yoke, the burden of English rule. So that is what is beginning to happen. The tea monopoly we talked about, whether it's the Boston Tea Party of 1773, there were the Intolerable Acts of 1774, coercive acts, the Quartering Act, the Quebec Act, among others. And then comes along, I'm going to fast forward because I want to show this video. People often met, there were two primary places of gatherings in the colonies. Where were they? Two main places. Churches were one, taverns were the other. In fact, taverns were preferred because they became, number one, there was alcohol, but number two, it was a place that became accepted where you could openly, publicly, with others, discuss ideas without repercussions. That make sense? And so they became a gathering place. But from time to time, the colonists within each colony would call meetings and the like. And in March, I think 23rd, the way I remember it, of 1775, there was such a gathering. So we have years of putting up with these acts, with these taxes, with the burden, with the presence of British troops, an increasing presence, the Quartering Acts, I mean, sometimes, many times in our own homes, we're having to feed them and shelter them. And so there's this growing unrest in the country until Patrick Henry made one of the famous declarations in his speech. And I talked so long, everything went dark. What's the famous phrase attributed to Patrick Henry? At a political gathering at St. John's Church. Yay. Do you not remember? He would proclaim, here we go, give me liberty or give me death. That's not all he said. In Richmond, Virginia, here we go.
Gentlemen, there is no longer any ground for hope. We wish to be free. If we wish to preserve inviolate those inestimable privileges which belong to us as free men, not basely to abandon the noble struggle in which we have been so long engaged, in which we have pledged ourselves never to abandon until the glorious object of our struggle be obtained. Then we must fight. I repeat it, sir. We must fight! Hope and to the God of hosts is all we have left us. Mr. Henry, what are they tell us, sir, that we are weak, unable to cope with so powerful an adversary. But when shall we be stronger? Will it be the next week? Or the next year? Will it be when we are totally disarmed and a British guard shall be stationed in every house? Shall we acquire the means of effectual resistance by lying supinely on our backs, hugging the delusive phantom of hope until our enemy hath bound us hand and foot? Sir, we are not weak if we make a proper use of those means the God of nature hath placed in our power. 3 millions of people, armed in the holy cause of liberty, and in such a country that which we possess, are invincible by any force our enemy can send against us. Besides, sir, we shall not fight our battles alone. There is a just God who presides over the destinies of nations, who will raise up friends to fight our battles for us. The battle, sir, is not to the strong alone. It is to the vigilant, the active, the brave. Besides, sirs, we have no election. Should we be base enough to desire it, it is now already too late to retire from the contest. There is no retreat, but in submission and slavery. Our chains are forged, their clanking may be heard upon the plains of Boston. The war is inevitable, and let it come. I repeat it, sir, let it come! We speak for peace, sir! It is in vain to extenuate the matter. Gentlemen may cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war is actually begun. The next gale that blows from the north shall bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is it that they wish? What would they have? Is life so dear? Or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God! I know not what course others may take. But as for me, give me liberty or give me death.
Anybody want to guess how old he was when he gave that speech?
27.
How much?
27.
Good guess.
27.
27. 39. As was true with Patrick Henry, wasn't just one of them, but most of the leaders of the revolution were wealthy, well-to-do, educated colonists. They had a lot to lose. You know, this is not like, sometimes we romanticize the past. This wasn't this, well, you know, it'd be okay. No, you know what would have happened had they lost? And what happened to many of them in the course of the revolution?
Yeah.
They died. You bet. I mean, that was, while, yes, it was dramatic in a sense, but it was real. They believed what they were saying. And it is in that context, they were so committed to staying free, to throwing off the oppression they perceived from the English government. They were willing to lay it all on the line. So, we will continue next on Wednesday. We're close enough. Please clean up your desk. Thank you.